Hello there, this is Michael Gio, and today I want to talk about one question that I always been asked, especially now that spring is coming in a few months here in the eastern part of the United States, and it is, should you plunk the mushroom when you're collecting it, or should you cut it in the base? Let's take a look. So, in order for me to answer that question, it's very important that we know our mushrooms. What exactly are mushrooms? And understand how they grow. What is a fungus and how they grow? We need to understand that in order to at least try to answer that on a very knowledgeable way, I guess, or in a way that would probably make sense. Now, in order to go there, like I said, we need to discuss certain things, especially. Has any research been done on this? And the answer is yes and no. Yes, there's this project that took over 20 years, more than 30 years, and they're just collecting random data, and then they put it together and they found the answer for this. But again, it is a very difficult experiment to do, especially because it takes years for that. That research was published, and like I said, I think it was like more than 20 years, 30 years. But again, there's so many variables, especially if you're doing this on an experiment that lasts that long. There's so many variables that is very difficult to make conclusions out of that. But it's always a big but. But we can answer that by knowing how mushrooms grow. The first thing that we need to know is, what is that? What is that mushroom? So I have a dry specimen here of Amanita abrupta here. This is very dry. And we need to understand. So if we're talking about a mushroom like this, the umbrella type of mushroom, this is a basidiomycete. And we need to understand how it is and what is this. And this mushroom pretty much is the fruit body that has all the spores in it. So it grows, it open, and pretty much all the spores disperse, and then of course from those spores mycelia would grow and then produce more mushrooms. Now, what are spores, mycelia, and all that? Well, the mycelia is pretty much that cotton-like structures that you see when you remove that mushroom. That pretty much is the fungus. So when that mycelia get together and they decide to reproduce, then they produce what we call fruit body, which I don't like that term neither because it's not a fruit. But whatever, that's a different story. A fruit body, and in there it produces the spores, and then the spores get dispersed, and they go everywhere, and then they grow, produce more mycelia. So that is one of the basic things that we need to understand in order to know the answer. The other thing is, why are you removing those mushrooms? And again, sometimes it's just to eat, and sometimes it's just to study. And that's another important thing. If you are studying those, you need to remove the whole thing. Why? Because there's some specific characteristic in some mushrooms, especially on the base, that are very important for the identification, as you can see in this specimen. So this Amanita has this base that is like a bulbed base. So this is a very important characteristic. If you remove that part, if you go there and cut that before when you're collecting it, there's a lot of Amanitas that look like this one, and of course can get confused. But there's no way to confuse an Amanita, especially Amanita abrupta, because that bulbed area in the base. Now, let's say that you're talking about this. This is a dry specimen of Pleurotus, the oyster mushroom. This is an edible. So you notice that in the base, there's a lot of small basidiocarps. In this case, basidiocarps is the fruit body, so it's the actual mushroom. And on top, you will see all the big the big specimen and the big fruit body. So if you're collecting it, let's say that you're going in the forest and then you're collecting this, it's better just to cut. Why? Because there's a big base and there's a lot of small one that can actually produce more. So in this case, you want to cut those on the top. Still, we haven't answered the question. Now we haven't answered the question yet. Should we plunk them or should we cut them? So we saw these two examples in this case, if we want to identify it and all that, we don't want to eat that, right? We remove the whole thing, the base. If we just want to eat this, but we don't want to let this to go to waste, you want to go, let's say, next day to get more, then you want to cut them. So still we have two of the possible answers in there. The other thing that is very important to understand is if you have experience collecting mushrooms in the field, normally, and this happened to me, people that they don't have a professional training in mycology, they just have known that for generations to go to the forest and pick up the mushrooms, and normally those people pretty much they just don't plunk them, they just cut it, because their understanding is that if you cut them, then there's all the roots can produce more basidiocarps. Now, one of the most important thing to understand in this case is these are not plants, these are mushrooms. So if you cut a tree, you have a lot of roots, the whole root system. And then if you cut the tree, maybe some trees can actually produce more branches, and eventually within years, then of course you can get another tree. Maybe not that tall, of course, but eventually it will get tall enough. In this case, when you cut a mushroom, it will not produce another basidiocarp because this is not a tree. These are mushrooms, so these are not plants. So that's something very important to understand. The mycelia can be from this spot in here through miles. It can cover a whole forest and be in the same fungus, not necessarily like this. No, it can be the same fungus that is spread underneath, right, on that network of mycelia in the entire forest. With if you're talking about a plant, a tree, that's not going to happen with the roots. So if something happened with this space in here, the mycelia, miles away, or let's just don't say miles, let's say 20 feet from that point, other basidiocarps can come in there. While on trees, you don't necessarily see that. So we need to understand that. So the fact that you leave, if that's the reason that you leave that mushroom just because the root system is there, well, that's wrong, because there's no really a root system that look like, but it doesn't work like that. Okay. The other thing that we need to understand is the type of mycelia. The type of mycelia that is underneath, eating those organic material underneath, like in the soil or in the dead wood, that mycelia, even though it's the same mycelia that is on the basidiocarp, is a little bit different. Okay, so what is it? Is it the same or is it different? Well, it's the same mycelia because it's the same organism, but it's a different type of mycelia. The mycelia that is underneath is producing a lot of different enzymes and proteins to eat. In other words, to eat. The mycelia that is on the basidiocarps is not worrying about to eat and absorb nutrients. Right now is worrying about to produce these specific structures that, or the instructions are in the DNA, in order to produce that, in this case, the basidiocarp, or if it's a morel, an ascocarp, because it's an ascomycete, produce the spores. And then in order to produce the spores and then disperse the spores. So the mycelia has a different goal when it's in the fruit body versus the one that is underneath. So when you remove that, let's say if either you cut it or remove it, the mycelia is still there. Okay. Another good point that is worth to mention is when you cut, let's say that you have this fungus here, and then you cut it, right? So then you leave this piece of part of the basidiocarp. That mycelia would not become another fruit body, but probably that get rotten. And that's a big problem right there, because a lot of bacteria that are everywhere other contaminant fungus, like this monster here, penicillium, that contaminate everything. In that case, those organisms are going to start eating that mycelia or piece of mycelia, which at some point was a fruit body. It would die. So that area of that mushroom that you removed and left a piece there, it would rotten, produce a lot of bacteria, yeast, fungus, and gonna rotten that. So imagine if you have something rotten here and a root system, which is in this case the mycelia is not gonna produce another basilocarp in that area. Why? Because there's other organisms that are producing a lot of different enzymes in order to eat. Okay, I always tell my students, when you see a fungus, the way that the fungus or fungi, mushrooms eat is, this is the mycelia. Imagine that my body's a mycelia. They vomit, and that vomit, and there you can find all the enzymes that pretty much eat whatever is in there, the organic matter, and then you swallow that vomit, and then you incorporate all those nutrients. Yeah, it's a little bit gross, but that's pretty much the best and grossest example that I can find. So that's the way that it is. So a lot of organisms, like contaminants and bacteria, they are pretty much there eating that portion of that basilocarp that will be dead after you cut it. Now, you can say, well, but if you take a piece of that basilocarp and put it on a plate, I can produce or clone mycelia and then produce more mushrooms related to that specific mushroom, and the answer is yes. But in this case, there's no other contaminants. And how you do that? Pretty much you cut a piece, and you have to have a sterile environment like a plate, like in this case, and then of course the mycelia can grow. And this place you can see, this is a piece of basilocarp of turkey tail, so you call it clone. I don't like to use that terms, that to clone the mushrooms from the wild and whatever, because that's not really cloning, but whatever. That's a different, another story. You pretty much take that mycelia and grow it in a plate. Okay, so that's another reason. Can be rotten. So if you remove that mushroom from there, you pretty much are not letting anything in there, only the soil and the material. So nothing would rotten or infect, let's just call it infect that area. So it's better for the mycelia to produce more basilocarps in there than if you left there. So I'm leaning toward, and I always said it, to say it's better to remove it than to cut it. For that reason. Now, the argument is, especially for people that go there to get those mushrooms, especially like edible mushrooms, it's just that it's like if you remove it, then they don't grow anymore. If you remove them or cut them, you are removing the possibility of spore spreading. So either or, you're removing the possibilities of that specific fungus to spread more spore. So you're letting that mycelia that is already in that environment, in the soil, to produce more basilocarps. So if your concern is like that you want to have, let's say, a morel patch every year, well, don't go there, and if you find 10, remove 5. If you find 100, remove 70. Well, if that's the case, if you really want to leave mushrooms in there, well, remove, I don't know, 25 out of those 75. Yes, you're going to waste a lot, but you are ensuring that those spores stays in that area. Okay, so there's no really a difference if you cut it or if you remove them, other than those. There's other theories also that you can come up with, but as I said, I have the experience of talking and going to look for morels with people that, like I said, they don't have a professional preparation in mycology, but they have knowledge. And I can tell. I go there and I say, well, I think this is it, and they go and tell me, no, we're going to find morels in here and in this area. And I ask why. Well, that's has been told by my dad or my grandparents, and we find specific mushrooms or morels in this case because they know. But normally they have been told to not plunk them, just to cut it. Okay, so again, if your concern is to leave, mushrooms for the following years, then pretty much don't collect them. If not, you can pretty much collect the whole thing. There's no difference between cutting it or plunking it.